Our Torah portion this week, Vayera, opens with what feels like an introduction or newly made acquaintance almost between God and Moses. In Exodus 6, God speaks to Moses and says, "I am the eternal. I appear to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai," another name for God. And in this verse, we're reminded that God and Moses continue the bond that will be preserved for the legacy of generations that come before and after Moses. And in this moment, God instructs God does not instruct Pharaoh. He instructs Moses to go to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and tell him to let the Israelites depart from Mitzrayim, from Egypt. And Moses, fearing his inability to lead because of his speech impediment, pushes back to God and pleads that he should not be the one to speak to Pharaoh. God assures Moses that his brother Aaron will be by his side to help him. And we all know what happens next, as we've watched some version of this movie and have reenacted it each year at our Passover Haggadah. Vayera means God appears, and it references God's emergence or interaction with Abraham. But in this Torah portion, God appears to the Israelites in a way that we've never seen before, in the form of the first 6 plagues. Moses and Aaron are to go before Pharaoh to advocate for the lives of the enslaved Israelites. And upon their encounter, Moses is instructed to throw down his rod to the ground, and God's wonders begin when the rod turns into a serpent. But Pharaoh and the Egyptian magicians are unabashed. They too throw down their rods, both turn into serpents. But it is God's serpents, however, that swallowed their 2 serpents, or their 2 rods. And then in chapter 7:13, we read that Vaychazek lev Paro. Pharaoh's heart is stiffened, is tightened, and he did not heed to the Eternal, as the Eternal had said. And God goes to Moses and warns him, Kaved lev Paro. Pharaoh is very heavy-hearted. He's stubborn. He refuses to let the people go, indicating that these difficult interactions are going to have to continue. And shortly thereafter, God tells Moses, with your brother Aaron, take your rod and hold up your arm over the waters of Egypt. Its rivers, canals, and pond, all its bodies of water will turn into... Good, you all passed the exam. Even the water that's in the vessels of wood and stone. And Moses and Aaron do as God says. Once again, Pharaoh's magicians were able to perform a somewhat similar trick. So they're 2 for 2 in this moment. And Exodus 7:22 says, Vaychazek lev Paro. Once again, Pharaoh's heart is stiffened, and he did not heed God's words. Pharaoh is clearly getting angry in this moment and frustrated, even though he is still able to match God's marvels with his own magicians. And the magicians in this story are really just here as a symbol. The battle is not between Moses and Pharaoh or Moses and the magicians, but God and Pharaoh. And this begs the question that if Pharaoh is so confident in his own magicians, why is he so consumed by this? And take note, the Torah doesn't tell us that Pharaoh gets mad or angry. The Torah tells us that Pharaoh's heart is tightened, it's stiffened. This is an inward response. His confrontation with the Israelite God challenges not just what he does, but who he is. His existential reality is put into question. And the same thing happens with the 3rd plague. The frogs are dispersed everywhere. Something changes this time. His magicians can't replicate this spectacle that they have done previously. So Pharaoh pleads with Moses to remove the amphibians with the promise that he will let the people go. God did as Moses asked. The frogs died in the houses, courtyards, and the field, and were piled in heaps until the land stank. They don't include that part in the movie, which is a shame. It's very exciting. So for a brief moment, when the frogs vanish, Pharaoh is able to collect himself and calm and begins to think more clearly without a plague in the midst. But his tranquility also creates space for his hatred towards the Israelites and their God to reignite. And wouldn't you know it, the kaved et libo, once again, his heart stiffens. So we see the same pattern with the next few plagues. And even though Moses and Aaron God through Moses and Aaron brings forth flies, fleas, and disease to the livestock, and this was only for the Egyptian livestock, not the Israelite livestock, same thing, Pharaoh's heart hardens. And for him to be challenged, Pharaoh, in this way, by a God that nobody can hear or see, is very problematic for him. It contests the very foundation of the Egyptian belief system. And now the sixth plague comes. A fine dust all over the land of Egypt will cause an inflammation, breaking out in boils on human and beast throughout the land. Now, hang on to your seat. Something is different here. Vaychazek Adonai et lev Paro. And now God stiffens Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh is no longer doing this to himself. God stiffened Pharaoh's heart. How can this be? The whole time we see that Pharaoh is boiling and stewing in his own existential crisis, and now after the sixth plague, God stiffened Pharaoh's heart? Why would God do this? If we have free will, how is this even possible? Doesn't this make it worse for the Israelites? And our tradition teaches us that we each have the free will to make our own decisions, and these decisions dictate not only what we do, but who we are. According to 15th century Spanish Rabbi Joseph Albo, God hardens Pharaoh's heart because God wanted to give Pharaoh the chance to free the Israelites of his own free will, not because he was intimidated or daunted by the plagues. The magicians were able to replicate the first few plagues where Pharaoh hardened his own heart. The God of the Israelites was clearly much more powerful, which was a direct threat to Pharaoh. When God hardens his heart after the sixth plague, two possibilities now open up. Without God hardening his heart, he would only have but one option, and that was the release of the Israelites because of his feeling defeated. God was giving Pharaoh an opportunity to choose the possibility of repentance, the possibility of releasing the Israelites because it was the right thing to do. And this is only one understanding of this text. When we read this story, especially around Passover, we're commanded to reenact having escaped Egypt. We think about enslavement in all of its forms in order to recognize enslavements that continue today while appreciating the many freedoms that we do have. On this Shabbat, I'm going to ask you to do something maybe a little bit unusual. I'm going to ask us to think about Pharaoh for just a moment. We have all felt what it's like to have our hearts hardened. Our heart hardens when something devastating or difficult happens. And in recent months, we all have a good reason for our hearts to harden, among many other feelings. And I'd like to suggest that a hardened heart, whether caused by your own feelings or maybe even by God, is not necessarily a bad thing. Rather, it can be used to fuel or to catalyst change for the better. With pain, we have choice. We can do harm to others because we're experiencing pain, or we can use that pain to better our world so we can all feel less pain in the future. This weekend, as Americans, we have the privilege of celebrating the wonderful works of peace that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. left as a legacy of inspiration for all of us. We know that the civil rights movement was, and in some ways continues to be, a difficult and painful journey. When we go back and listen to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, we are moved, often to tears, by his strength and inspiration. But behind those words was enormous struggle. Solving the issue of race in America was one that had so many possibilities. Take, for instance, the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois had originally believed that social science could provide knowledge to solve the race problem. He eventually came to understand that in a climate of infectious racism, expressed in evils such as lynching, Jim Crow, segregation laws, and race riots, social change could only be accomplished through agitation and protest. Du Bois' approach clashed with many of the very influential Black leaders of the period, such as Booker T. Washington, who preached a philosophy of accommodation, urging Blacks to accept discrimination for the time being and elevate themselves through hard work and economic gain, thus winning the respect of whites. And while Du Bois' methods may have not appealed to everyone, he understood that education through intellectual dialogue would be the only path to have radical change. And by the way, he was the first Black American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. Du Bois' intellect was not unique in the community, but his approach was. In his essay published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1897, Strivings of the Negro People, he wrote that Black Americans should embrace their African heritage even as they worked and lived in the United States. Du Bois wanted Black Americans to bring their whole selves to American society rather than shy away from who they were. This was a courageous idea for the time, and as we know, a very difficult fight. And I have to imagine that at times, his heart was hardened and he felt discouraged when he and African Americans experienced severe racism and suffered greatly. How does one keep hope in those moments? I find myself asking, how do you find the strength to engage in intellectual education and dialogue when the person before you doesn't even acknowledge your existence? Du Bois is commemorated for his incredible contributions today and played a significant role in the founding of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909. Sadly, there are moments today where I catch myself with a hardened heart. Behind the enormous pain we all feel for what is happening in Israel and to Jews all over the world, we grow aggrieved, angry, sad, at times even perplexed. With the free will we are given, how do we transform our pain from a hardened place to works of peace? How do we continue to share our faith and tradition with others who make hurtful assumptions about who we are? To elevate Du Bois' approach, we must continue to live Jewishly. We must connect our tradition and live proudly as Jews, inviting all of those of other faiths into our homes so they too can share the incredible traditions we have. We must continue to educate ourselves daily, not just about Israel, but of other faiths, other races, and of course, through our own faith as well. So we can deepen not only our understanding of the world, but deepen our own Judaism through learning of others. As we approach one of the most grounding holidays in a few weeks, Tu B'Shvat, and I hope you'll all join us for a Tu B'Shvat Seder on the 31st of January. Let us think about ways to plant roots using our rituals to strengthen our hearts in this time and create peace within ourselves and in our world. In the book of Isaiah, we read, Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, velo yilmedu od milchama. Nation shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again study war. Let us hope for a day where war is something of the past. Shabbat Shalom.